In the city's outskirts, where crumbling buildings stood silent under a cloak of darkness, there was an old warehouse, rotting with time, reeking of dried blood, and untouched by sunlight. It was a place where voiceless souls were held captive, where dogs once cherished and named had been reduced to mere tools for gambling, amusement, and profit for the cold-hearted. And there, in that abyss of misery, lay Bruno, a fighting dog with a muscular frame and eyes that once burned with fire, now curled up in a rusted iron cage, breathing heavily through pain and despair. Another fight had ended, another victory. But this time, the price wasn't just the deep gashes across his shoulders or the blood soaking his fur. It was something emptier, something colder. Bruno felt nothing. No fear, no rage, just a numbness, still and filthy, like a puddle left behind after the rain. Silent, stagnant, and meaningless. Cheers erupted, bets shouted, glass shattered, and laughter rang coarse and triumphant throughout the warehouse. Sounds Bruno had heard 100 times now felt distant, broken and fading, as if the world outside could no longer reach the calloused core of his heart. He had once been a puppy, born into the warm embrace of a small child, cradled in gentle arms, called by soft names, running freely under the sunlit grass. But all of it was ripped away on one cursed evening, when a strange car pulled up, and a cold steel chain dragged him from home. Since then, darkness had been his only shelter, and every day was a loop of pain, fear, and spilled blood. In that world, Bruno was forced to learn: bite before being bitten, growl before being attacked, survive even if it meant surrendering every last trace of innocence. He became fierce, relentless, numb. But no matter how tough his body grew, his heart was still alive. And over time, it wore down. He no longer wanted to fight. He no longer wanted to be their snarling weapon. Then fate, in its unpredictable cruelty, threw him a chance, a fragile, sudden chance, like the sky finally offering a drop of rain to the dying. Thunder exploded overhead as a torrential rainstorm swept in. Wind screamed through rusted metal sheets, slicing the cold deeper. But the storm blew open a long-sealed iron door, just a sliver, a crack between darkness and the world beyond. Bruno lifted his head. In his clouded eyes, a faint light flickered, weak but real. He pushed up, his front legs trembling from open wounds, blood dripping onto the cold floor. A loud thunderclap masked his groan as he clawed at the ground, squeezing through that narrow crack, tasting for the first time in years the scent of freedom, wet earth, wild grass, and the fresh mud of rain. Without looking back, Bruno ran, bolted into the night like he was fleeing from the shadow of his past. Rain lashed his face like a whip, his eyes squinting, breath hitching. But nothing could stop him. The cold pierced his spine, every breath a knife, every step a fight against fate. But on he ran, across open fields, through tangled hedges, into the deep forest where darkness swallowed everything. He didn't know where he was going. He had no destination. Behind him was hell. Ahead? He'd never been taught to dream of ahead. But with every last drop of strength, with a heart torn yet still beating for something nameless and sacred, Bruno ran, not to escape, but to seek something that might still be left of life. Maybe peace, maybe forgiveness, or simply a place where he wasn't a monster in human eyes. And so, in the pouring rain of a pitch-black night, Bruno, the survivor of hundreds of blood-soaked battles, bearing wounds not just on his flesh but deep in his soul, broke free. He didn't just run to survive. He ran to reclaim himself, a lost soul clinging to the final thread of hope that, even as a dog, he too deserved to be loved again. Bruno wandered through the forest like a fading shadow, swallowed by relentless rain. His large paws, caked in mud, left tired imprints on the cold earth of an unfamiliar land. Since breaking free from the hell of cages and chains, he hadn't stopped, not even to rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face of the man with the twisted smile and hollow eyes, the one who used to whisper after each win, "Good boy, you were born to kill." That man, the master of the dogfighting pit, was no more than a butcher in human skin who never touched Bruno with kindness. Only iron rods, electric prods, and a voice filled with venom. Bruno's deepest scars weren't from the other dogs, but from that man, the one who took more than freedom. He stole Bruno's trust. He shattered every memory of warmth a home was supposed to hold. The terror of being dragged back haunted him. It kept his legs moving, even when every muscle screamed to stop. He didn't know how far he had gone, only that each pale sunrise filtering through the thick canopy made his stomach twist with hunger, and each cold night made his old wounds sting with fresh pain. Hunger wasn't like physical pain. It was slower, constant, and cruel. It gnawed at his body like a quiet curse. Sometimes Bruno would collapse beside a rotting tree stump, tongue dry, breath shallow, heartbeat faint, as though life itself was hanging by a single thread. He had once been a warrior. Now, he was a wounded creature fighting both nature and memory. Nightmares stalked him in sleep. Curled in the dark woods, he'd hear the wind and feel again the imagined tug of that dreaded chain, pulling him back to where tomorrow didn't exist. He tried to hunt, but with a battered body and weakening limbs, he couldn't catch a rabbit or sneak up on birds hiding in the brush. All he could do was sniff around tree roots, hoping for fallen fruit or edible bark, things he once never considered food. Once, he stumbled upon a deer struck by lightning, but before he got close, a bear roared from the shadows. Bruno had to back away. He was no longer the fiercest, no longer feared, just a survivor, lost between wild beasts and the ghosts of humans. Still, he walked, even when his legs felt like stone, even when his dry eyes could no longer cry. Something inside, faint but stubborn, kept burning. He yearned to live not as a fighter, but simply for himself. Maybe, somewhere deep in the forest, there would be a place without cages or shouting, without fists or fear. Maybe just a patch of land, quiet and still, where a dog once damned could lie down and finally sleep, dreamless, unafraid. Bruno never wanted anything more, and for that, he kept going, hungry, hurt, alone, but still moving forward. And then, on a night when the sky seemed to have run out of stars, when the dense canopy above was wrapped in darkness like a damp, moldy shroud draped over Bruno's wounded life, the exhausted dog was dragging himself down a narrow path, blanketed in decaying leaves, when a strange scent crept into his nose. It wasn't the familiar stench of blood and open wounds. It wasn't the rotting musk of a dead animal. It was something warmer, more fragile, and alive. Bruno stopped in his tracks, lifted his head, nostrils twitching, breathing it in deeply. The scent was faint, nearly lost in the misty night air, but with the instincts of a creature that had survived by scent alone, he knew. This was something he had never encountered during all his time wandering through the wilderness. At that same moment, a sound, so soft it could have been a breeze brushing the leaves, brushed against his drooping ears. At first, Bruno couldn't tell if it was real or just another ghostly trick of his frayed memory. But then it came again, longer, uncertain, weak, and aching with pain. A cry, a child's cry. Bruno stiffened instantly, his whole body alert. His eyes darted through the fog, scanning the darkness, trying to pierce it, to find the source of that fragile sound. The scent, lightly sweet, tinged with milk and the rawness of new skin, hit something deep in his chest, like an old memory being stirred. He had never smelled anything like it in the fighting pits, in blood or despair. This was the scent of pure life, of something newly born, not yet even aware of the world it had entered. His body was worn to the bone, but his legs moved anyway, guiding him through the thick brush, chasing the sound that grew just a little clearer with each step. Every paw pressed against the brittle forest floor let out soft, crackling noises, echoes of the quiet storm inside him, caught between the hard instinct of survival he had been forged in and something gentler now rising from the depths of his heart. He parted a patch of tall grass, and there, under a lone shaft of moonlight breaking through the trees, Bruno stopped. Before him, lying alone on the cold ground, was a small bundle wrapped in an old, tattered blanket. From inside, the crying had softened, fading like the last flicker of a dying candle. A tiny hand, pink, trembling, peeked out from the edge of the cloth. Bruno stepped closer, each footfall slow and heavy, as if afraid one wrong move would make this fragile being vanish like a mirage. Just a few steps away, he halted again, staring down at the wrinkled, pale face of a newborn, far too small, too delicate to be surviving alone in the freezing forest. Dew glistened on the baby's skin. Its lips were dry, and its whimpering had shrunk to soft, broken gasps. Something inside Bruno tightened, as if a hand had clenched around his chest. He didn't understand why. He didn't have a name for this feeling. But something cracked open inside him. A soundless growl, a silent rage not aimed at the child, but at the world that had abandoned them both like disposable things, unworthy of life. In that moment, the image of his old master flashed through Bruno's mind. Those cruel eyes, that sneering mouth, the way food was thrown at him like scraps for a beast, the hateful words, "I feed you because you kill, not because you live." And then, as if by reflex, Bruno growled, not to threaten, but as if making a vow to himself. This child would not die out here, nameless and forgotten. Not while he could still stand. Not while his heart, however damaged, still beat. He lowered himself and inched closer, letting the warmth of his breath brush gently against the baby's cheek. A soft cry escaped the child. An answer. And in that instant, in the heart of a frozen forest where hope should have long since died, an invisible thread was woven. Between a dog once discarded and a newborn just forsaken by the world. Neither of them could understand what was happening. But somewhere deep in the primal instinct of all pack creatures, in a heart still bleeding but still alive, Bruno knew. He was no longer walking alone. In that moment, when Bruno's warm breath brushed gently against the baby's cheek, something long buried stirred within him. A part of his mind, forgotten and trampled under years of brutal training and human shouting, suddenly flickered back to life. He lowered his head further, ears folded down, and in his eyes, usually cold and empty, there was a strange glint, unfamiliar even to himself. Under the pale moonlight, thin as silver mist suspended in the sky, the baby's tiny face became clear. Pale skin, cracked lips, eyelids puffy from crying, and a body shivering uncontrollably like a leaf tossed in a storm. The blanket wrapped around it was soaked with night dew, too thin to offer any warmth, and it seemed almost impossible that a child so small, curled into a forgotten patch of grass, had survived this long alone in the heart of the forest. Bruno stood motionless. He didn't growl, he didn't bark, he just stayed silent. A heavy silence, like the hush before a storm finally breaks, a moment where all chaos falls away and nothing remains but the need to face oneself. Inside him, two forces clashed violently. One was the wild instinct sharpened by blood and combat, the side that had been taught the weak are prey, that this tiny, helpless creature could not survive. But the other, the side that had only just begun to awaken, was softer, hazier like morning fog, and it touched something buried deep in Bruno's heart. Something he thought had long died. Compassion. He remembered being starved to make him more aggressive. He remembered curling up in a freezing cage, untouched, unnamed, only hearing the scrape of rough food bowls shoved through bars and the heavy clank of a lock sealing his world shut. That loneliness, that feeling of being thrown away, of no longer being seen as a living thing, he now saw mirrored in this child. A baby who could not speak, who could not walk, who had never even had the chance to call someone mother. A gust of cold wind swept through, making both the dog and the baby shiver. Bruno instinctively stepped back and looked around as if expecting someone, anyone, to come. To say it was a mistake, that no one could leave a baby here, alone, in the slicing cold of a forest night. But no one came. Only the rustling of insects, the sigh of wind in the trees, and the moon slowly disappearing behind thick clouds. And in that moment, Bruno understood. This world had turned its back on them both. And if he turned away too, there would be no one left to do otherwise. He took one step closer, lowered his body again, and gently touched his damp nose to the baby's clenched little hand. The child stirred, releasing a faint whimper, lips moving wordlessly. Bruno trembled, not from the cold, but from the strange sensation now flooding his mind. A feeling never named, never allowed to exist in the violent world he came from. For the first time in years, his heart wasn't racing from fear or rage, but from one simple, overwhelming truth. He didn't want this baby to die. And so, under the darkness of the forest night, where a child had been abandoned by humanity, and where a soul once trained to never feel had begun to thaw, something quietly miraculous happened. Compassion sparked within the heart of a dog once seen as savage. And from that moment on, Bruno stepped into a new path, not as a fugitive, but as a protector. No one told him to do it. No command was given. But he chose, for the first time in his life, to stand for life. Bruno lay close beside the baby, his heavy breath brushing against the child's pale cheek. Skin so cold it had turned a faint purple from the night dew that seeped through the thin blanket. He stared at the baby for a long time, as if needing to confirm that the fragile sound he'd just heard wasn't a trick of his exhausted mind, that this little life lying in front of him was truly still breathing, still holding on, even if just barely. But just as a gentle tremor stirred in his heart, so unfamiliar it felt almost foreign, the gnawing beast of hunger awoke deep inside his hollow body. His stomach clenched painfully, the low growl of emptiness echoing loud in the forest's stillness, and Bruno instinctively pulled back, legs trembling not just from cold, but from the weight of his turmoil. He turned away, stepping out of the damp grass, scanning the area, sniffing the air for any sign of hope. A hint of food, a small mouse, even the stench of decay, anything that might dull the fire now burning through his insides. But aside from the damp scent of forest soil and wild grass, there was only one smell lingering in his nose: the scent of the child. It was strange, a blend of milk, warm human breath, and the faint mustiness of fabric left too long unwashed. Yet it stirred nothing of the hunter in him. It didn't arouse or tempt. Instead, it held him in place like a fine, invisible thread drawn taut in the dark. Bruno stopped after just a few steps. His head dropped low, eyes half closed, ears heavy against his skull. He didn't know what to do. Didn't know if he should keep moving in search of something, anything, that might keep him alive for a few more days or turn back to that tiny life still trembling behind him, completely helpless, still waiting on a miracle. One part of him, the part that had survived hundreds of fights, kept reminding him, you can't protect anyone if you starve to death. But another part, quieter, softer, and just recently awakened, whispered, you'll die differently if you leave it now. This wasn't just the old tug-of-war between hunger and survival. This was a violent clash between two sides of who Bruno had become. The cold, killing machine forced into existence by human cruelty, and something else, a creature just beginning to remember that he had once been born, capable of love. That thought stopped him in his tracks. From somewhere deep inside, old memories flickered to life, hazy and faint like smoke, of gentle hands cradling him as a pup, of a warm porch roof shielding him from his first rain. But all of it had been shattered long ago, the moment that man with the lifeless eyes first fastened a chain around his neck. Bruno looked up at the sky. It was pitch black, not a single star in sight. The wind rushed through the forest, hissing like the cries of forgotten souls, and Bruno felt, in that moment, like one of them. A creature who'd been abandoned, stripped of a name, denied the right to choose. But now, for the first time in all those years of being controlled, he was standing at a crossroads where no one else could decide for him, to leave or to stay. And he chose. Without hesitation, Bruno turned around and walked back to the baby. He looked around once more, as if to confirm that no one would come to claim the right to do what was right. Then he lay down, positioning his body to shield the child from the wind, tucking his tail close, curling his legs protectively around the small bundle. His scarred, muddy body, once a weapon in the ring, was now a wall, a barrier between a defenseless infant and the merciless cold of the world. The wind still blew, but now warmth began to seep from Bruno's chest into the blanket, touching the tiny frame inside. The baby's breathing was still shallow, but steadier now. As if sensing this presence, no longer foreign, it shifted slightly, and its tiny hand, completely unaware, brushed gently against Bruno's tangled fur. The touch was so light it could have been missed, but for Bruno it was everything. It was the first call of trust, something he had never known in his entire life. Lying there, guarding a nameless child in the heart of the cold, wild forest, Bruno no longer thought about food. He didn't think about his wounds or the years of cruelty behind him. All of that seemed to dissolve, making room for the only truth that mattered now. He would stay. He didn't know what would come next, didn't know if he would survive the days ahead. But in this moment, he had found a reason not to give up. In that rare moment of stillness, as Bruno curled protectively around the child like living armor, the baby's faint, fragile breath began to warm the space between them. Slowly, gently, like waves softly lapping the edges of a shoreline, long thought dry. Bruno closed his eyes, not out of sleep or exhaustion, but as if allowing his heart, for the first time, to turn inward and face the memories he had buried deep in darkness. Not the wounds from fangs and claws, but those inflicted by the quiet betrayal of a hand that once stroked him with affection. The memories didn't come in order. They flooded in like a broken dam, sweeping Bruno back to the earliest days when he was still a hopeful little pup, ears perked at every call, tail wagging endlessly at every touch. Back then, he lived in a small house where a woman sat knitting on the porch, and a boy often cradled him in his arms until they both fell asleep. Every meal was a full bowl. Every rainstorm brought a closing window and a soft voice saying, "Come in, sweetheart, it's cold out." But it all ended on a rainy day. A strange car stopped at the gate. A man handed over money in exchange for a promise. "Just a few days of training, the dog will come back stronger." Bruno was taken aback. There was no return, no goodbye. The place he was taken to was another world entirely. A world of blood, growls, and the howls of caged dogs. A place where each day spun in a cycle of training, torment, and fear. The man who owned the fighting ring, the one who bought him, never saw Bruno as a living being, only as a tool, something to be forged into perfection. He always carried an electric prod, always smelled of antiseptic and stimulants, and he always spoke in a dead, mechanical voice. "You're not allowed to be weak. You're a fighter." Every time Bruno hesitated in a match, every time he faltered at the sight of an opponent collapsed with wide, pained eyes, the man lashed him, mercilessly. "You don't get to feel sorry," he would growl. "Not if you want to live." Bruno learned to swallow his hunger after being starved for 3 days for not attacking fast enough. He learned to growl even when he only wanted to back away. And worst of all, he learned never to look into the eyes of the dogs he brought down, because in them he saw himself, saw the same despair, the same silent question. Why? Every scar on Bruno's body wasn't just a battle wound, it was a milestone, marking another piece of himself lost. Until one night, in the cold rain, after a brutal fight that left both dogs collapsed in exhaustion, the spectators walked away in disappointment. The man knelt beside Bruno, bloody, dazed, barely able to keep his eyes open, and said with finality, "If you get weak again, I'll bury you alive." That night, another stormy night, when the wind blew open the rotting door of the warehouse, Bruno ran. Not like a fighter claiming freedom, but like a soul drained to its last ember, suddenly desperate to survive. Not for someone else's approval, but for himself. He didn't run because he understood freedom. He ran from betrayal, from the place where love had been twisted into a weapon to entertain strangers placing bets in the dark. And now, lying beside a tiny, helpless life in the middle of an unfamiliar forest, something strange happened. Bruno no longer felt alone. He was no longer a nameless warrior cast out into the world like expired equipment. For the first time, he felt a connection with another life. One with no leashes, no orders, no pain, just presence, just trust, from a creature too young to know fear, too innocent to judge. The baby didn't know that Bruno had killed, didn't know he had roared over blood-stained floors, didn't know he had once been called a monster. And because of that, for the very first time, Bruno felt free of judgment, free from being defined by what he had done to survive. His heart stirred, not with pain, but with something that felt like healing. In the hush of wind through the trees, in the faint breathing of the baby, and the crashing echoes of memory, Bruno realized maybe he still had something left to give. Maybe there was still one thing he could do to reclaim a piece of what had been taken from him. He could protect. And so, in the fragile rhythm of a small life asleep against his chest, Bruno felt something he had never known a name for. Not duty, not command, not instinct. It was a quiet bond, like a thin red thread gently tied around his heart, anchoring him, reminding him that he was no longer just a stray creature adrift in the world. But because of that bond, Bruno knew he couldn't stay here, not in this forest, which grew colder and more dangerous with every passing minute. The baby's life was too fragile, too faint to withstand the night wind and the cold seeping into its tiny bones. If they didn't find shelter, a thick tree, a hollowed-out stone, anything to block the wind, sooner or later that small chest would stop rising. And Bruno knew if that happened, the one intact piece left in his scarred heart would die with it. He stood up slowly, each movement deliberate, careful not to wake the child cradled in sleep beneath his chest. Moonlight poured over his mud-streaked dark brown fur, glinting off the wound on his left shoulder, still oozing blood. But he didn't care. Bruno's eyes scanned the forest, pausing on the denser trees in the distance, where the shadows swallowed all sign of a path. He didn't know where he was going. What mattered more was that they couldn't stay. They couldn't wait. They couldn't place this tiny life into the uncaring hands of fate, which had never once smiled on creatures like him. Lowering his head, Bruno gently took a corner of the tattered blanket in his jaws, lifting it with the utmost care. Carrying another life changed everything. It made his whole body tense, made him feel more vulnerable, and yet, strangely, more powerful than ever. He stepped forward, each heavy footfall pressing into the damp forest floor. The blanket swayed softly with his movements, wrapping the baby like a silk cocoon against the endless sky. The crackle of dry leaves beneath him echoed in the quiet woods like whispers. But Bruno didn't look back. His spine dipped slightly beneath the weight, but his eyes were lifted higher than ever, the eyes of someone who had decided to leave no one behind, even if he had once been left. As he pushed through tangled brush, Bruno couldn't help but remember his days in the cages. Back at the fighting camp, if a dog was injured too badly or deemed too weak, it was dragged away without a sound, and never returned. Bruno had seen it happen more than once, had watched those dogs disappear with fear in their eyes, ears drooping in despair. No one ever asked where they went, not the other dogs, not the humans. Back then, Bruno had thought, maybe death is a mercy, better than living like a ghost. But now, with a defenseless life clenched gently in his jaws, he understood something different, that even the faintest life is worth defending, until its final breath. No one had ever taught him that, but the baby, with its barely there breath and soft presence, had shown him just by existing. The moon rose higher, casting thin, silvery light through the treetops, glimmering faintly on the child's face peeking out from the frayed blanket. Still asleep, the baby's lips were pressed together gently, as if dreaming of warmth, of a voice, of a home. Bruno looked down at that face, then up, toward the unknown path ahead. The forest deepened. The night thickened. Nothing was certain. But this time, uncertainty didn't scare him, because what lay behind was no longer something to flee, but something he had chosen to leave behind, for the sake of something small, pure, and still untouched by cruelty. And so, in the freezing hush of the forest night, a body battered and broken carried a newborn life forward. No one saw the start of that journey. No one cheered. No one called his name. But had anyone passed by, they would have stopped, gone quiet, and bowed their head. Because at that moment, a creature once labeled a monster had begun to become something else entirely. A hero. And so, in the fragile silence of the night forest, where only the wind brushing through the leaves and the faint heartbeat of the child blended into the darkness, Bruno kept moving. Every step felt like it carried the weight of the sky. The cold had sunk deep into his bones, and the blood slowly seeping from his wounds dulled his senses into a numb ache. But it was the quiet, still life wrapped in the damp blanket he carried that kept Bruno's mind from collapsing. Then, through the fog of hunger and exhaustion, a familiar scent reached his nose. Water. Clean, cool, living water. It pulled him back to the present like a thread tugging him from the edge, reminding him that he could not afford to stop. His ears perked up, nostrils quivered, pulling in every trace of moisture in the air. Then, driven by instinct, Bruno quickened his pace, following the scent like a wild animal desperate for life. He pushed through dense undergrowth, where branches scraped his fur like needles and roots slipped under his paws. Still holding the edge of the blanket carefully in his jaws, he climbed a mossy ridge, muscles trembling, and then halted. Before him was something so beautiful, it caught in his throat. A small stream, flowing gently between two rocks covered in soft green moss. The moonlight glistened on the surface like a silver ribbon winding through the forest. Without hesitation, Bruno stepped into the shallows. The icy water immediately wrapped around his paws, making his body shiver. But he ignored it. A greater concern weighed heavier. The child. He carefully laid the bundled blanket on a patch of soft earth by the stream, using his body to shield the baby from the breeze. Then, finally, he lowered his head and drank. The first gulps of water felt like salvation, easing the burning in his throat, sliding cool and clean down his chest. His eyes closed as he gasped for breath, as if his body had reached its breaking point and at last found release. But Bruno didn't drink for long. Just a few mouthfuls. Then he turned immediately back to the child, his silent companion, who couldn't ask for water but needed it far more than he did. He looked at the baby's face, lips now tinged purple from cold and cracked from dryness, and fear crept into his every breath. If he didn't act quickly, this tiny soul might slip away, silently, unnoticed by the world. Without a second thought, Bruno nudged a large leaf that had fallen nearby, gently pushing it into the stream. He used his paw to gather water into the leaf until it held a small pool, then nudged it up near the child's mouth. The water touched the baby's lips. No reaction. Bruno froze. He edged closer, bumping the baby's cheek lightly with his head, blowing warm air from his nose to trigger a response. 1 second. 2. Then, the tiny lips twitched, opened slightly. A drop of water slipped in. A sound escaped. a faint, thin whimper. Not a cry, just a whisper of life. Bruno's heart clenched with relief. He pulled back slightly, watching as the baby stirred, lips trembling as if trying to remember what it meant to be alive. Bruno's eyes softened, filled with worry, and something else. Hope, a feeling he thought had long since withered away. In his past, no one had ever needed him except to fight. No one had ever waited for him except for the next match. But here, in the stillness of the wilderness, there was a life depending on him, entirely. And somehow, that need made his hardened heart begin to soften, to crack, revealing something that had always lived beneath the surface. Not a predator, but a companion, a protector. Under the cold night sky, beside the murmuring stream, Bruno lay close to the child again, his body blocking the breeze, his gaze fixed on the small face, slowly regaining color. The night was far from over, and the forest remained silent. But beside that gentle stream, two lives, one abandoned by humans, the other rejected before it ever had a chance, were keeping each other warm, not with fire, but with something deeper, something no one had taught them, yet they had found in each other, the will to live, the strength to endure, and the quiet miracle of love. As the first pale light of morning filtered through the forest canopy, casting a thin veil of mist across Bruno's aching shoulders, he knew he couldn't keep walking endlessly without a destination. Through the long, sleepless night, he had climbed uneven hills, waded across freezing streams, and pushed through thorny underbrush that tore at his matted fur and already bleeding skin. Now, though he still held tightly to the child in his mouth, every muscle in his body had begun to betray him, trembling, twitching with exhaustion, as if his very bones were sounding a tired, distant toll of a soul nearing its final breath. But then, as if fate were offering a quiet reply to that wordless perseverance, something appeared at the end of the rugged path, beyond a cluster of aging pine trees and a crooked wooden fence sagging under the weight of years. There it was, a cabin, a small wooden hut nestled deep in the forest, looking like it had been forgotten by the world. Bruno stopped, still gripping the edge of the blanket gently in his jaws, eyes fixed on the dusty window where a faded curtain stirred faintly in the breeze. The house showed no signs of life, no smoke, no flickering light, but something about it gave off a sense of warmth, a feeling faintly familiar, like the memory of a porch long ago, where a puppy once curled up in someone's arms and was comforted after his first storm. Bruno stepped closer, his feet heavy but sure, because he knew, if there was any place left on this earth that could offer the child a chance to survive the cold and the loneliness stealing each breath, it was here. The wooden door creaked open, and a man appeared as if he had been waiting all along. A thin old man with silver hair falling to his brow, a scraggly beard, and eyes as deep as a well, the kind shaped by too many years of silence. In his hand, he held a stick, not to attack, but as a shield, the last defense of someone who no longer trusted the world. When his eyes landed on Bruno, large, caked in mud, covered in scars and dried blood, he froze. His hand tightened on the stick, but he didn't step back. There was no fear in his eyes, only a cautious tension taught by years of hurt, everything he'd learned could betray. Then his gaze dropped to the corner of the blanket clutched in Bruno's mouth, where a tiny face peeked out, lips blue from cold, skin pale, chest rising in weak, uneven breaths. The man stood still, stunned. His aged eyes widened as if he were seeing something impossible. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he stepped out the door, walked to Bruno, and leaned down to look closer at the child wrapped in the protection of what anyone else would have called a wild dog. For a moment, both man and dog remained motionless. One had locked his heart after loss, the other had survived brutality and blood, and between them, a child who couldn't speak but was forcing two closed-off hearts to meet face to face. Bruno didn't growl. He didn't bow or beg. He didn't move forward. He simply stood still, his eyes steady but desperate, as if saying, "I don't need anything for myself. Just save this child." And the old man, though he heard no words, understood. Through some quiet instinct, maybe born from his grief, he saw in the eyes of the dog a pain too deep to voice, the pain of one who had been cast out, who had lost something precious, and who now, with the last of his strength, was trying to protect what he could, just as the old man once wished he could have done for the grandson who never came back from that one fateful day. Without a word, the man nodded. Then, gently, he reached out his arms. Bruno understood. He softly placed the baby down on the front step, then took one step back, eyes never leaving the child as the man bent to lift it. Tenderly, as if lifting something fragile and sacred, he whispered, not to Bruno, but to himself, almost like a promise to someone long gone. "She'll be all right, I swear." And with that voice, with that look in his eyes, he opened the door wide, not with a command or a signal, but with trust, with recognition, with the kind of silent understanding only two lost souls can share in a world that had been too cold for both of them. Inside the tiny cabin, the man rekindled a fire that had long since gone out. He laid the child gently on a soft wool blanket in front of the hearth and began to boil water in a battered copper kettle. Bruno lay nearby, his body inching forward, ears perked, eyes unblinking. Every sound of the child's breath echoed inside his heart. When the man tended to Bruno's wounds, his hands trembling from age but steady with care, they didn't speak. They didn't need to, because between them had already formed something wordless and whole, the understanding of two beings who had both been left behind, both broken, both learning, slowly, painfully, how to love again. Through the presence of one fragile life, newly arrived in the world, they were reminded of a truth neither had dared believe in for a long time, that no one is meaningless as long as someone is willing to hold on. As the warmth from the fireplace slowly spread through the small cabin, wrapping around the three souls like a thin blanket pulled over years of loneliness, the old man sat quietly in his worn wooden chair. His eyes never left the child, still lying motionless in the damp blanket, her tiny body now eased somewhat by the heat and the water Bruno had brought. His gaze, clouded with age, held something strange and aching, as though in that fragile figure he was seeing something once dearly familiar, something once priceless, and stolen from him in a moment too cruel to forget. The room was still. Only the crackle of burning wood and the faint whistle of wind brushing across the mossy roof broke the silence. But the quiet no longer felt cold. It now sounded like a prelude to a story long buried, one that had waited patiently in the dark. When the old man finally spoke, his voice was low and hoarse but steady, as though the years of silence had made every word heavier, dragging the past out with them. "I used to have a grandson," he began. "A little boy, wild, bright, and full of sunshine. After my wife passed, he was the only light I had left." He paused. His bony fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair, but his eyes stayed fixed on the child by the fire. "That day, it was just another ordinary afternoon. I was in this chair reading the paper. He was outside, playing with that red plastic car he loved more than anything. Then the phone rang. Just one call. I stepped inside, 3 minutes, no more, and when I came back out, the gate was open. He was lying in the street." His voice faltered. His throat closed up as if packed with stones. His hands trembled, but he didn't cry. There were no tears left after years of carrying the same silent question. Why did I turn my back? Bruno, lying near the fire beside the sleeping child, slowly lifted his head to look at the old man. He didn't understand every word, but in his amber eyes was something deeper than comprehension. Recognition. Quiet empathy. The shared understanding of someone who had also turned away once, who had once left behind an injured companion, who had been forced to act against everything good in him, in a world where compassion had no place. After that, the old man continued, his voice like wind through the dry trees, I stopped believing in anything. I left the city, left everything that reminded me of him, moved out here, alone, no friends, no family, no one. I punished myself with silence and solitude. He looked down at his hands, calloused and aged, resting on his knees. I thought if I never loved anything again, I'd never have to lose anything again. Bruno slowly rose and stepped toward him, lifting his gaze to meet the man's. In those old, wounded eyes, he saw himself. Damaged, cautious, but still capable of recognizing something good. And in Bruno's steady gaze, there was no fear, only respect, a quiet willingness to listen, and something like gratitude for giving the child, still breathing across the room, a chance to live. The old man hesitated, then reached out. His hand, though weathered and slow, gently rested on Bruno's head. It wasn't the kind of touch Bruno had ever known, never rushed, never careless, but one full of meaning, as if, through those eyes and scars, the man was seeing a reflection of his pain, battered, but still clinging to the possibility of kindness. When you came, he said quietly, glancing from Bruno to the child, you didn't just bring a baby. You brought me a second chance, a chance to protect someone again, to not turn away. He sighed, his hand still resting on Bruno's head, his voice cracking but firm. I don't know why fate chose a dog like you, or a baby like her, to walk through the dark together. But if you carried her all the way here, I won't let you carry the rest alone. And in that moment, 3 fates, an old man marked by loss, a dog covered in scars, and a child discarded by the world, quietly touched. Not through dramatic words, not through miracles, but through presence, through endurance, through something silent and stubborn, love. None of them asked for anything, but each, in their way, gave something to the others, something more lasting than any rescue, hope. After that peaceful morning, when the child had regained some strength under the quiet care of the old man's weathered hands, and Bruno lay curled by the fireplace like a warrior finally allowed to exhale, everything seemed calm. But deep in Bruno's instincts, something stirred. He knew this peace was only temporary. The forest still obeyed its own rules, and sometimes danger didn't come from humans or the shadows of memory. It came from those who breathed the same wild air, where instinct and territory were sacred laws. And then, as if summoned by some wordless warning, it came. One late afternoon, Bruno slipped quietly from the cabin, following his usual route along the forest edge to search for food. Something, anything he could bring back for the old man, or at least to ensure no threats were lurking nearby. But this time, something in the air shifted. The wind changed. Gone was the scent of damp leaves and faint chimney smoke. In its place was something raw, primal, and ancient. The scent of another predator. Bruno stopped instantly. His head lowered, ears pricked forward, eyes scanning the eerily still trees. And then, from behind a thick pine trunk, a shape emerged, a wild wolf, coat a mix of ash gray and silver, eyes the color of cold forest dusk. Its body was lean and strong, nearly Bruno's size, but sharper, quicker, honed by survival. And it stood now, not hesitating, not hiding, at the edge of its domain. The two animals faced each other. No growls, no sudden moves. Just silence stretched taut between them like a drawn bowstring. The wind hissed between them, carrying scents of old blood and frozen soil, thickening the air until it felt like one wrong blink could tear it open with tooth and claw. Bruno stood firm, muscles tense, legs rooted to the ground. His tail was neither tucked nor raised. Only his eyes changed. Eyes that had once known blood, had been forced to kill to live, had seen opponents crumble beneath his feet. But today, those eyes didn't hold the hunger to win. They held the fire to protect. The wolf growled softly and stepped forward, just half a pace, then stopped. It saw it too. This was no nameless intruder come to steal or challenge. This was a warrior marked with wounds, carrying the scent of humans. Yes, but not fear, not weakness. And in those eyes it saw something more. Loss. Purpose. The kind of presence that didn't stand here for itself, but for something far greater. Another gust of wind passed between them, and this one carried something else. Faint traces of worn cloth, dried milk, the smoky warmth of a hearth. Scents Bruno had carried with him all this way. Scents that told the wolf one thing clearly. The creature before it was not alone. He was guarding something. Their eyes stayed locked. Two spirits, mirror images forged in wildness, who had simply taken different paths. One shaped into a weapon by human hands, the other shaped by the forest into instinct. Between them there was no hatred, only a silence thick with caution and respect. Then the wolf exhaled slowly, turned, and without sound or show, melted back into the pines as if it had never been there. Bruno remained where he was, not triumphant, not relieved, just watchful. Only when the rustle of paws on leaves faded completely did he finally turn, retracing his steps toward the cabin, toward the child still sleeping, and the old man who by now had likely stoked the fire again. As he walked back through the deepening dusk, the last rays of crimson sun brushing the treetops, something subtle but significant had changed. The forest had acknowledged him, not with violence, not with submission, but with respect, the rarest gift between those who understand that the greatest victory is to protect, not destroy. After Bruno left the forest clearing, heart still pounding from the wordless confrontation with the wild wolf, an echo of primal survival still lingering in his veins, but softened by the quiet recognition exchanged between two creatures of instinct, he intended to return straight to the cabin, as he always did, to check on the child. But just as he stepped off the narrow trail, the first gust of wind from the north hit him, thick with moisture, carrying the unmistakable scent of rain rolling in from the heavens. The scent of earth bracing to receive the fury of 1,000 falling drops. Bruno froze, ears instinctively flattening as he lifted his head toward the sky. Above the canopy, the clouds had already gathered, dark, roiling, flickering with lightning like the furious gaze of nature itself, ready to test whatever dared survive beneath it. Bruno bolted for the cabin, no longer cautious, no longer quiet. When he arrived, the old man was already standing at the porch, eyes fixed on the tree line. And when he saw Bruno emerge from the brush, their eyes met. One human, one canine, for just a second. No words, no signal, just understanding. Inside, the child had been wrapped more tightly in layers of soft cotton fabric, found in the back of a forgotten cupboard. But she was still far too fragile to withstand the cold storm clawing its way toward them. The cabin, already worn thin by time and weather, would not hold. Its roof, patched with whatever could be found, might give way the moment the storm truly arrived. The old man looked from the child to Bruno, his eyes full of hesitation, then slowly nodded. A silent message. Only you can carry her to safety now. Bruno didn't hesitate. He lowered his head and gently took the bundled child in his mouth, not just with care, but with the full weight of purpose, like a guardian with nothing left to lose except what he swore to protect. The wind screamed through the trees, tearing leaves from their branches, scattering them like brittle warnings. There was no clear destination, but Bruno pushed forward into the forest, through thorny paths, and over drenched ground. Rain came down, not in drops but in sheets, curtains of cold slicing through the sky, drenching him to the bone, soaking through his thick coat and chilling him to the marrow. He searched desperately for cover, and then, through instinct honed by years of surviving the unforgiving, he found it. An ancient tree, long ago struck by lightning, its massive roots curled upward, forming a hollow just deep enough to shelter the small, trembling bundle. Bruno crawled in, placed the child on the driest patch he could find, then wrapped his body around her, shielding her completely. His back took the full weight of the storm. Rain lashed at his skin, burrowed into open wounds, and turned dried blood into warm, diluted streams. But he didn't make a sound. The rain didn't let up. Thunder cracked like it was splitting the sky in two, and with every flash of lightning, the silhouette of two forms, a large one curled around a smaller one, flickered against the gnarled trunk of the tree. A quiet testament that no matter how angry the world became, the will to protect would not bend. The child stirred now and then, lips twitching, breath weak but steady, and that was all that mattered to Bruno. His body shook uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. He could no longer lie down. He stayed braced, legs stiff beneath him, like a living awning, like the last wall standing between fragile life and the fury of the world. The storm lasted nearly an hour, longer than any fight Bruno had ever known. But this time, the enemy wasn't teeth or claws. It was a collapse. It was his limits, creeping in with every breath. And the greatest difference of all, he wasn't fighting to survive. He was fighting to save something else. As the rain began to ease, the sky shifted from pitch black to smoky gray. Bruno remained in position, soaked, shaking, every bone in his body crying for rest. But his eyes stayed open, his ears alert, his heart still beating. In the cold dusk air, he lowered his nose to brush gently against the baby's cheek, a trembling gesture that asked a single question. "You're still here, aren't you?" And the child, in that fragile instinct that doesn't yet understand speech, stirred softly, pressing closer into Bruno's chest. Just the smallest movement, but it was enough. Enough to keep that last glowing ember inside him alive. Enough to make sure that even a spark, in the heart of a dog once called soulless, could be light enough to carry them both through the dark. As the child nestled deeper into Bruno's soaked chest, its faint breath seemed to whisper the gentlest answer he had ever received, that the child was still here, still alive, still clinging to that fragile warmth in a brutal world. Bruno exhaled quietly, his eyes closing for a brief moment, a fleeting pause in a journey too long and filled with loss. But then, from the other side of the forest, a blinding flash tore through the sky like a colossal blade, and just seconds later, a deafening explosion shook the ground. Trees bent, and birds scattered in a chaotic frenzy toward the horizon. Bruno sprang to his feet. The acrid scent of smoke hit his nose even before the roar of flames followed. Then, in a terrifying silence, the firestorm erupted with the scream of a dying forest. Flames surged from the hillside where lightning had struck a long, dead tree. The strong winds, remnants of a storm, no longer eased. They turned into fire's ally, lifting glowing embers like fiery moths ready to devour everything. In mere breaths, the gray sky flared red, and the entire forest before Bruno transformed into a sea of living fire. Without hesitation, Bruno bent down, carefully gripping the blanket-wrapped child in his jaws, then turned and ran, not toward safety, but back through the only path he knew. Every route, every trail, every dry stream bed etched into memory. This was no escape from a chain or a cage. It was a race against death itself, carrying a life so fragile that even smoke could silence its breath. Smoke was already falling over the treetops. Wind-lashed dry branches scratched across his face. Bruno squinted, his skin burning as hot air slammed into him like a wave. But he didn't stop. The child began to wheeze softly inside the blanket, a sound so weak, so heartbreaking, that Bruno felt a fear deeper than any he had ever known. He pushed harder, weaving through trees catching fire, paws landing on scorched leaves still smoldering with embers. A burning branch crashed ahead. Bruno skidded to a halt, veered sharply toward a narrow gap, nearly slamming into a rock wall, but never loosened his grip on the child, not for a second. The smoke thickened. Small flames started dropping from the canopy. Bruno's breathing grew labored, each inhale like swallowing fire. Yet in his stinging eyes, there was no surrender. At one point, he threw himself through a thicket smoldering at its edges, flames licking his shoulders, fur singed, skin blistering. But he made no sound, refused to slow, refused to let the pain override the primal instinct to protect. And then, just when it felt like his body would collapse, Bruno saw it, a familiar dip in the earth ahead. The stream where he once brought the child to drink, the place with no dry trees, where water still trickled. Using the last of his strength, he lunged forward, leapt over a fallen trunk, through a cloud of smoke, and landed in the shallow stream bed. As his paws touched the damp mud, he collapsed with ragged breaths. Gently, he placed the child on the cool earth, nudged the blanket toward the water's edge, doing everything he could to keep the baby from suffocating or burning in the forest's fury. The fire still raged behind them. Explosions echoed, and trees crashed. But at that moment, Bruno curled his body around the child, forming a shield, a living barrier between life and death. And in the flickering red light, beneath burning leaves, that image, a scarred, scorched dog refusing to move, became a silent emblem of loyalty and sacrifice, proof that even a heart once taught to be fierce can love with everything it has. Bruno's breath hadn't yet steadied from the wildfire escape when he lifted his head to face the path ahead. The only route out of danger, now a merciless challenge. It wasn't a gentle trail or a moonlit road. It was a steep, slippery slope, eroded by heavy rains, the ground melting beneath each paw. For any healthy animal, it would have been a terrifying climb. But for Bruno, exhausted, blistered, bleeding, trembling, and carrying a life that depended on him, it might as well have been a wall between survival and death. He lowered his head, gently adjusting the edge of the blanket around the child, as tenderly as cradling a fragile flower that had survived the storm. Wind swept up from below, thick with ash, soot, and scorched earth, choking the air. There was no detour, no shortcut, only upward, and Bruno knew that even if he collapsed midway, he couldn't turn back. The fire still loomed behind them. The forest was no longer safe, and the baby in his jaws deserved a chance to keep breathing. The first step onto the slope tested every fiber of his body. His paw slipped immediately, and he nearly tumbled forward, dragging the child with him. But instinct surged. He braced with his hind legs, muscles tightening like a drawn bow to hold balance. Then the second step. Everyone had to be deliberate. One wrong move could send them both sliding down. Blood trickled from wounds on his legs, mixing with mud to form streaks beneath the moonlight. But Bruno didn't care. The pain stabbed like 100 needles with every push, but his eyes stayed locked on the ridge above, where the air was clearer, where hope could begin again. Strong winds bent trees sideways, burnt leaves whipping into his skin, each strike another burn. At one point, his front leg sank into a crumbling patch of earth, his body lurching, weight crashing onto the blanket's edge. In a desperate moment, Bruno tilted his head, clenched his jaw, using the last strength in his neck to hold the child. Veins bulged, his limbs trembled in the cold, muddy ground, but he didn't let go. Didn't back down. Didn't cry. He had been left behind once. He swore it would never happen again. The wind sliced through him, but Bruno's heart blazed, not with wildfire, but with will. The fire no chain or blow could ever extinguish. It carried him up the muddy slope, every slip followed by a stubborn climb, never looking up to see how far remained, because he knew that if he stopped, everything would end. Time vanished, replaced by labored breaths, claws scraping the earth, and blood dripping into the dirt. And finally, after one last heave, Bruno reached the top. His legs buckled beneath him. He collapsed, barely able to move, but still held the blanket tight, where the baby still breathed, faint but steady. Moonlight shone down on the two of them, one who had no strength left and one who didn't yet understand the world, both lying on the edge of the slope, survivors of one of nature's cruelest trials. And in that moment, when all seemed on the verge of breaking, Bruno opened his eyes, lifted his head, and looked ahead, where the faint outline of a small roof peeked beyond the trees, a sign of human life. He knew then. He couldn't give up. The journey wasn't over yet. When Bruno lifted his head through the thin mist hovering just above the ground, his amber eyes blurred with exhaustion, yet still sharp enough to catch the vague outline of a roof behind the trees. An old, weathered house, buried deep within the forest, alone and silent, as if time had forgotten it long ago. With torn, bleeding shoulders, trembling hind legs, and the heavy blanket still clenched in his jaws, Bruno knew he had nothing left to give. But that place, crumbling though it was the last hope for the child breathing faintly within the shelter of his protection. The sky was still overcast. Ash drifted lazily on the breeze, but the scent of fire was gone. What remained was a damp wilderness and the jarring cries of forest birds, as if the entire woods were still reeling from a storm without a name. Bruno staggered toward the house, each step drawn from the last reserve of his strength, but his eyes stayed locked on that single goal. He knew it might be the final line between survival and the end. The house came into focus as he neared, its tin roof full of holes, wooden walls faded to gray, the front door hanging crooked on rotting hinges. But to Bruno, it wasn't a ruin. It was a fortress, a last umbrella against the rain and wind for the tiny life he'd carried through mud, smoke, and blood. He set the baby down gently on the moss-covered doorstep, then turned back and threw his shoulder against the door. The wound split open instantly, sending a jolt of searing pain through his body, darkening his vision. But he didn't stop. Another shove, then another, until the hinge gave out and the door collapsed inward, revealing a dark, dusty space, dry, quiet, and most importantly, safe. Bruno turned back, gently took the child in his jaws one more time, and stepped inside with the last of his strength. He found a corner where the wind didn't reach, where the floor was dry and the air less cold. There, he carefully placed the baby down, pulling the edge of the blanket up to cover its chest. The air smelled of dampness, rotting insects, and layers of dust over forgotten things, a broken wooden chair, a few decaying books on a shelf, a torn quilt slung over the corner of an old bed frame. Bruno dragged over the driest scrap of that quilt, folded it with his muzzle, and tucked it gently beneath the baby, quiet and tender like a mother preparing a first sleep after a day too long and hard. But he didn't lie down yet. Instead, he made a slow circle around the room, cautious, alert, every breath a stab of pain. He sniffed the corners, checked the gaps in the wood, then returned to the child, lay close, and curled his body around the tiny figure like living armor. The wind slipped in through cracked walls, but between them, one large wounded body and one small, trembling soul, was a soft, steady warmth. It wasn't just heat. It was a silent promise. I won't leave. Not again. Night fell hard. Outside, the forest still smelled of ash and loss. But inside that broken house, where two lives hung on by threads, a faint flame flickered to life. It didn't burn bright or bold, but it endured. Through the cold, through the rot, through the dark, a flame made of trust, loyalty, and love, something no one had ever taught Bruno, but something he'd learned through every choice he made. When Bruno finally lowered his head beside the child, his entire body ached as if every muscle had been wrung dry by wind, fire, rain, and steep climbs. All he had left was the steady, faint breath of the small life curled next to him under the tattered blanket. Inside the damp, decaying house, with its broken roof, faded wooden walls, and dust blanketing every corner, Bruno gave no thought to his pain. Blood still trickled from his hind leg, his left shoulder numb from burns. But he stayed curled close, his head resting gently beside the trembling child, as if his very purpose now was to keep the baby warm through the cold night after the inferno. Outside, morning broke. The first light pierced the thin mist clinging to the scorched treetops, carrying a pale warmth to the earth still steaming from the fire. The forest birds called out faintly, their cries like the soft groans of a wildland still trying to rise after being torn apart. And in that quiet moment, a figure appeared, gently, silently. But it was the turning point Bruno and the child never expected. Her name was Evelyn, a young journalist and nature lover, hiking alone to find inspiration for a piece on the recent wildfires. With a camera slung across her chest and a light backpack on her shoulders, she followed an old path winding deep into the northern woods, an area the satellite maps still showed as untouched and uncleaned after the blaze. Each step felt like a conversation with nature, something she'd done for years. But today, something in her chest felt different, like an invisible thread pulling her forward, as if something unknown was waiting just ahead. When she spotted the old cabin nestled among the scorched trees, Evelyn first thought it was just another abandoned shack, one of dozens she had passed. But then, from behind the half-hinged door, came a sound. Not human, not quite animal either. A strange rhythm, almost like breathing tangled in the wind. Cautiously, she stepped closer, nudged the door open with care, and her heart nearly stopped at the sight that met her. A large dog, its body caked in dried blood and mud, lay curled protectively around a newborn baby, and both were still alive. She froze, her eyes widened, lips parted but silent. Of all the disasters, accidents, and war zones Evelyn had witnessed in her career, nothing compared to this. A wild dog, clearly abandoned and badly injured, shielding a human infant in the middle of a burnt forest after a firestorm that should have taken everything. Bruno didn't jump up. He didn't growl, but as she took one more step, his gaze, deep, fierce, exhausted yet razor alert, cut straight through her. He didn't need to bark to speak. "I won't let you hurt it, no matter what." Evelyn stopped immediately, hands raised in the air, tears already brimming in her eyes from the sheer weight of what she was seeing. With all the softness she could gather in her voice, she whispered, "I won't hurt you. I'm here to help. I promise." She didn't dare move closer. Slowly, hands trembling, not from fear, but from emotion too vast for words, she pulled out her phone. She recorded a short video, capturing the dog's breath, the baby's faint rise and fall, the scars on Bruno's body, and the tender way he licked the child's forehead. A gesture so gentle, so instinctively kind, it felt like witnessing something sacred. Then she reached for her camera, snapping a few pictures. Her whole body tensed just to keep her hands from shaking too hard to focus. Then, she made the call, the one that changed everything. "Hello? Rescue team? I'm in the northern forest. I found a baby alive after the wildfire. But there's something more. A dog, probably stray, saved it. I don't know how to explain it. You need to come, immediately." While she waited for help to arrive, Evelyn sat a short distance away from Bruno. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched and quietly cried. She knew what she was witnessing wasn't just a story. It was something the world needed to read. Not about war, not about politics, but about truth, the quiet kind. That love needs no words, that loyalty isn't bound by species, and that sometimes the most broken creature is the one capable of the deepest kindness. When Evelyn ended the emergency call, her heart still trembled with the weight of what she had just witnessed. A scene no camera could fully capture, something only the heart could understand in its sacredness and rawness. Bruno remained where he was, unmoving, his body forming a solid wall around the baby, the last line of defense against any threat that might still come. Evelyn had moved closer by now, but still didn't reach out. Not because of fear, but because she understood. The space between them was more than physical. It was the fragile border of trust, of endurance, and of that sacred instinct to protect, something Bruno had carried every step of this brutal journey. The sound of a helicopter echoed in the distance, as if the outside world had finally found its way to a place it had forgotten. Dry leaves scattered in the rotor wind, and the shrill sirens of the ambulance cut through the silence that had, until then, only held the faint breaths of a fragile life. When the rescue team entered the ruined house, with flashlights, medical kits, high-visibility vests, and all their gear, they were stopped not by walls or doors, but by the unflinching eyes of an injured dog standing between them and the baby. Bruno growled softly, ears pinned back but eyes steady. Not threatening, not aggressive, but sharply alert. It was a look that said, "One wrong move, and I will use everything I have left to protect this child." "Wait," Evelyn whispered, stepping forward and raising a hand to halt the medics. "He's not dangerous. He's just doing what he's done all this time. Protecting." She knelt on the dusty floor, reached a hand slowly toward Bruno, and said gently, almost like a lullaby, "They're here to help. You did so well. So well. But now let them take care of the baby, okay?" Her voice caught as she said it, because she knew it's never easy for a creature that has been abandoned, hurt, and betrayed by humans to trust again. Bruno's eyes never left them. Every person, every motion, every step, he watched them like a silent soldier guarding his post. But something in Evelyn's voice, the honesty, the gratitude, the respect, softened his gaze just slightly. He didn't retreat. He didn't step away. But the tension in him eased. His eyes still watched. His body was still shielded. But it was as if he was saying, "I won't bite, but I'm not leaving either." The medical team understood. One of them, an older doctor with silver hair and the calm demeanor of long experience, crouched low, not rushing, not forcing closeness. He extended a hand for Bruno to sniff, then slowly sat beside the child. "Buddy," he said quietly, as if speaking to a comrade, "you've kept this baby safe all the way here. Let us take it from here, all right?" Miraculously, after a pause, Bruno shifted slightly. He didn't move far, just enough to allow space for the doctor to touch the child's forehead. The whole rescue team seemed to hold their breath as the baby stirred. The tiny body was cold, lips tinged blue, but there was a heartbeat, weak but steady. The doctor carefully lifted the infant, wrapping it in a warm, clean blanket, and rushed it outside toward the waiting ambulance. Bruno stood up. He stumbled from the pain in his limbs but didn't let himself fall. Quietly, steadily, he followed. No sound, no complaint. His eyes locked on the child, as if connected by invisible thread. He was a shadow of loyalty, unable to be separated from the life he'd defended with every ounce of blood and strength he had left. When the baby was placed inside the ambulance, Bruno sat down beside the step. Not barking, not moving, just lifting his head to look in. A female paramedic moved to push him aside so they could close the door, but Evelyn stepped in. "Let him go with the baby," she said. "He's the only reason that child is still alive." No one argued. And so Bruno, scarred, filthy, aching, was lifted with care and placed inside the ambulance beside the infant. Not as a stray, not as a threat, but as a silent hero entering the human world, not with fanfare or medals, but with a body worn by fire, a heart lit by love, and a story of devotion that no one who saw it would ever forget. As the ambulance slowly rolled away from the forest, carrying Bruno and the baby wrapped tightly in a clean blanket, the hearts of the rescue team began to ease, believing, perhaps, that the worst was finally behind them. But behind that moment of relief, something dark was awakening, a past that was cruel, unpunished, and far from over. While Evelyn remained at the edge of the forest, answering questions from reporters about the miraculous rescue, an unease crept over her. It wasn't the people around her. It was the way the forest behind had fallen into a strange, unnatural silence. She lifted her gaze toward the narrow dirt path leading back to the old cabin, the place where she had met Bruno and the baby just hours earlier. What she didn't know was that, at that very moment, a stranger had quietly emerged from the forest's edge, his expression calm, not surprised, but calculating. He walked with certainty, as if he already knew where he was going. The footprints leading to the cabin weren't found by chance. He remembered them well. The kind of memory burned into someone who had once led Bruno deep into the woods on a rainy night, yanked the chain around his neck tight, and left him behind like a tool gone useless. What he didn't know was that Bruno had survived that night, escaped. And after days of wandering in the wilderness, he'd found something that gave him a reason to keep going. A tiny child abandoned in the cold forest, the first soul to ever make him feel what it meant to protect. But to this man, Bruno was just a runaway fighting dog, a living piece of evidence that could expose the horrors he had orchestrated. Bruno wasn't just any dog. He had been trained to kill. And more than that, he was a silent witness to the blood-soaked matches, the illegal bets, the underground fights where pain was currency. And now, as Bruno's image, wrapped around the baby, heroic and tender, spread across news broadcasts and flooded social media, the man realized something terrifying. He was at risk. Worse still, he recognized the child in Evelyn's video, the baby that had gone missing from the illegal charity shelter he quietly funded. A cover for a child trafficking ring, it was where orphans and kidnapped infants were funneled overseas under the guise of international adoption. That child had been marked for disposal after a leak threatened to expose the operation. The baby was supposed to vanish, but Bruno had destroyed that plan. Now there was only one way to protect himself. Bruno had to die. No witness, no animal to point back at him, no amber eyes that once saw him leave that baby to die. Nothing, if Bruno was gone. He slipped into the cabin, boots sinking into the still sooty earth. In his hand, he held a worn metal chain, the very same that once choked Bruno's neck, dragged him across blood-stained cement floors, the relic of a past soaked in cruelty. He ran his fingers along it like a hunter reminiscing about old trophies. But the house was empty. He scanned the space, eyes flicking across the dust until he bent and picked up a singed scrap of fabric. A slow, cold smile crept across his face. "You're still alive, but not for long," he muttered into the stillness. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a folded knife, the blade catching a faint glint in the early light. It wasn't meant to kill quickly. It was meant to finish things cleanly, quietly. One strike, to the neck. He pulled out his phone, opened the video Evelyn had posted, and paused it on the frame of Bruno curled around the child, eyes calm but unyielding. A silent guardian. He turned off the screen and murmured, "I made you fight, and now you choose to die for love? Fine, I'll end this the way a dog like you deserves." He turned, heading swiftly toward the mountain road. He knew the ambulance would have to stop at the ranger checkpoint before leaving the hills. If he was fast, he could tail it, wait for a transfer, a distraction from the press. Just a few seconds of carelessness would be enough. But what he didn't know was this. Bruno had changed. He was no longer led by a chain or shaped by a whip. He had walked through fire, climbed mountains, crossed the line between death and survival. And now, there was only one fear left in him, not being able to protect the child. And if he had to face the one who turned him into a weapon, Bruno would not hesitate. Because this time he wasn't fighting to survive. He was fighting so someone else could. As the man descended the mountain path, silently tailing the rescue convoy with deadly intent, he had no idea that the breath of the forest, though quiet, was tightening around the footsteps of someone carrying hatred and shadows. Beneath his worn coat, in the grip of a coarse hand ready to draw the folded knife at a moment's notice, pulsed a single, dark resolve. Bruno must die, the last living witness to crimes long buried. He couldn't allow a dog to unravel the secret web he had spun over years. He had silenced many, discarded countless animals, and crushed weaker lives without pause. This, he believed, would be no different. But what he didn't expect was that the rescue team had been forced to return to the cabin. A forgotten medical file belonging to the baby had prompted the detour, and Evelyn, the woman who had discovered Bruno, volunteered to go back alone. She asked the driver to wait at the forest edge, then made her way down the trail, back to the abandoned house, a place that had left an imprint on her heart. As she stepped inside, a gust of wind creaked the old door. What Evelyn didn't know was that he was already there, hidden among the trees, watching her with the patience of a predator, waiting for the perfect moment. Bruno, resting in the back of the ambulance, suddenly jolted upright. His nose caught a scent, burnt, metallic, and vile, a stench he thought he'd buried long ago. But now it came roaring back like the crack of a whip across his memory. His eyes darkened, his body shuddered, and then something deeper than pain surged through him. He sprang from the medical bed, let out a raspy growl, and leapt from the vehicle, his wounds still unbandaged, but his instinct unshaken. Back at the cabin, Evelyn had barely reached the files when the rear door slammed open, and there he stood, broad frame, hollow eyes like dark pits, and in his hand the glint of a blade. "You shouldn't have come back alone," he whispered, his voice cold as the wind. Evelyn stepped back by instinct, trying to scream, but he lunged. She fell, hitting her shoulder against the old wooden table, eyes wide with terror. And just as the knife arced down, Bruno crashed through the front door like a thunderbolt. The dark gray dog, its body torn and bleeding, hurled itself at the man like there was no tomorrow. Its claws ripped across his chest, tearing through the jacket and knocking him flat on his back. The knife flew from his hand, sliding across the floor under the table. But the man wasn't slow. He rolled over, regained his balance, and reached into his pocket for a second blade. He never came without a backup, never unprepared to kill. Bruno took a step back, teeth bared, blood still trickling from reopened wounds. But his eyes, they weren't just sharp. They were burning, like the last flame left in a dark world. The man stepped forward, sneering through clenched teeth. "I made you. Don't you remember? I taught you how to survive." Bruno didn't growl, didn't flinch. Instead, he moved forward, slow and steady, step by step, like a soldier who knew he might die but refused to let evil get any closer to the child or the woman he had chosen to protect. Then, without hesitation, Bruno launched. The cabin became a battleground. The man tackled him to the ground, slamming the knife deep into Bruno's left shoulder. Blood burst out. Bruno howled, but he didn't stop. Even with the blade in him, he clamped down on the man's knife hand, biting with a strength that wasn't physical anymore. It came from somewhere else, from something that had been growing inside him this entire journey, something that felt a lot like love. The man screamed, thrashing, trying to shake him off. But Bruno didn't release. He held on like everything depended on it. Because it did. Evelyn, barely able to move, crawled toward the chaos, eyes searching for anything. That's when she saw it, the first knife under the table. She grabbed it and rushed forward just as Bruno was flung into the wall. The man rose again, ready to strike, but Evelyn stood her ground. Her hands trembled, but her eyes didn't. Holding the knife up between them, she shouted, "That's enough. One more step, and I won't hesitate." Her voice rang through the cabin like a final warning. The man froze, blood dripping from his wrist, rage flashing in his eyes. But then it was too late. Sirens shrieked outside. Headlights swept through the broken windows. The rescue team and police had arrived. The man knew it was over. He cursed loudly, then darted out the back door, vanishing into the forest, leaving behind the cabin, Evelyn, the child, and Bruno. Bruno lay still on the floor, blood pooling beneath him, his breaths ragged and thin. But even as his eyes fluttered, he turned his head, just slightly, to look one last time at the baby, now safe in the arms of a nurse. He was alive, barely, but more importantly, the child was safe. The battle was finished, not with weapons, not with sirens, but with a loyalty so fierce even pain couldn't silence it. As the wail of the ambulance echoed through the forest, flashing lights cutting through the mist and spilling into the crumbling cabin where a life-or-death battle had just played out, the man had already disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind not just the failure of a villain, but the silent victory of a creature he once saw as nothing more than a tool, now risen as a hero. Emergency responders stormed in, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the area, but all movement stopped the moment they saw what was inside. A woman trembling, holding a baby wrapped in a torn blanket. And beside her, Bruno, motionless on the blood-soaked floor, his breath reduced to broken, rattling gasps. Immediately, the medical team split into two. One group carefully received the baby from Evelyn, who by now was unable to hold back tears, and rushed the infant into a second ambulance that had just arrived. The updates came quickly. The baby was alive, heart rate weak but stable, no critical injuries, signs of dehydration and malnutrition, but nothing immediately life-threatening. A young nurse cradled the baby in her arms, whispering in disbelief, "It's a miracle after all that you're still here." But everyone's hearts sank as their eyes turned to the dog who had fought to the very end. The deep gash in Bruno's shoulder had struck a major artery. His body bore the bite marks, claw wounds, and brutal signs of a final stand. "We need an ambulance for the dog!" Evelyn cried out, almost pleading, as a medic hesitated, clearly uncertain. "Not a dog," she said, voice breaking but firm. "A hero, and he's dying in front of us." One of the firefighters, an older man, hardened by years of witnessing life and death, stepped forward, took off his jacket, and gently laid it over Bruno's body. Then, in a voice that left no room for debate, he ordered, "Call the nearest veterinary station. If they can't come, I'll drive him myself." 10 minutes later, a mobile vet unit, a rare presence in post-wildfire zones, arrived like a last beam of hope. Bruno was lifted onto a stretcher made of wooden slats. The vet team worked quickly to stop the bleeding, administer fluids, and stabilize the wound. Even unconscious, he was breathing, barely. Each inhalation was thinner than the last. Any more delay, and that brave heart might stop for good. Evelyn walked alongside the stretcher, her hand wrapped around his scarred paw, whispering like a prayer, "Please don't give up. That baby still needs you." At a veterinary hospital in the nearest town, preparations were made in minutes. An emergency surgery was ordered. The chief surgeon, an Asian woman with steely eyes and a voice full of quiet empathy, entered the OR with 2 assistants. "The life of this animal matters as much as a human's today," she said. No one argued. They moved like they were treating a fallen firefighter, a wounded officer, a warrior brought back from the front lines, because Bruno was all those things. He just never had the words to say it. Meanwhile, at a larger hospital across town, the baby lay in a neonatal incubator, closely monitored by nurses on either side. Doctors reported a slow but steady recovery. In the hallway outside, Evelyn sat alone, still clutching the baby's torn blanket, eyes flicking back and forth between 2 doors, one leading to the child's recovery room, the other to a screen broadcasting live updates from the veterinary surgery. And in that quiet corridor, she understood something deeply. These 2 lives were now bound together by something far stranger than fate, a thread woven from instinct, suffering, and unconditional love. Outside, the world was just beginning to stir. The story was spreading across social media like wildfire. Footage of Bruno's burning eyes inside the cabin, the video of the baby being carried into the ambulance, hashtags exploding. Bruno the Guardian, hero dog, save them all. But in here, in the hush between 2 hospital rooms, the fight for life was still ongoing. Only this time, neither of them was fighting alone. As night slowly settled over the hospital hallway, Evelyn remained seated in silence between 2 closed doors, one sheltering a fragile life wrapped in tubes and warmth inside an incubator, and the other concealing a surgery room where Bruno was still fighting for his own. Outside, the world kept moving. The stories of Bruno the hero dog and the miracle baby from the wildfire had spread like wildfire, a wave of emotion rushing through the internet, stirring millions of hearts and bringing many to tears. Among those following the story was a young couple sitting quietly in a small suburban apartment, eyes fixed on the TV screen. They watched the footage of Bruno curled protectively around the baby, a living vow of protection that seemed to transcend all barriers. Their names were Lucas and Hannah, a couple who had struggled for 10 years with infertility, who had visited countless clinics and orphanages in search of a miracle. But year after year, every door closed, leaving behind cold nights and quiet embraces filled with silent longing. When Lucas saw Bruno's eyes on the screen, exhausted, yes, but fiercely alive, eyes that spoke of courage where words could not, he turned to Hannah and whispered, "There's something about that baby and that dog I can't look away." Hannah, with tears brimming, could only nod. The next morning they drove more than 200 miles, bringing with them every adoption document they'd ever prepared and a small box wrapped carefully. Inside, a pale blue knitted blanket they had once made for a child they never got to hold. When they arrived at the hospital, they didn't demand anything. They didn't ask for more than they deserved. They simply approached the front desk and softly said, "We heard about a baby that was rescued. And a dog." The nurse met their eyes, paused, then nodded gently and led them down the corridor, to the hallway where Evelyn had just stepped out from Bruno's surgery. After a moment of quiet listening, Evelyn looked at them, not as strangers, but as someone who had stood beside those two lives through fire, blood, and ruin. She led them to the window of the neonatal room. Through the glass, the baby lay in a small crib, wrapped in clean linens, oxygen tubes at his nose, skin pale but breathing, steady and alive. Hannah broke into tears, not from pity, but because the moment the baby's eyes fluttered open for the first time, there was something in that gaze, something warm, deep, and strangely familiar. Lucas gently squeezed her hand, then turned his eyes toward the opposite end of the hallway, where Bruno, still unconscious but out of critical danger, lay under soft blankets, receiving fluids, a blanket tucked around him like the world itself was thanking him. And in that moment, this quiet, seemingly disconnected scene, a baby who had no words, a dog who had never been called family, and a couple who had never heard the laughter of a child, all came together. It was not grand or loud, but it was deeply human. Then, Lucas was permitted to step into the nursery. He leaned close to the crib, and the baby stirred, blinked, then, suddenly, offered a faint, fluttering smile. It wasn't full or clear, but it was enough to say, "I'm safe." Evelyn smiled, nodded, and led Hannah toward Bruno's room. As the door creaked open, the dog stirred. His eyes were still heavy, his body wrapped in layers of bandages, but he sniffed the air with a quiet snort, faint but firm, as if to say, "I know someone just walked in." When Hannah stepped closer and gently laid her hand on his head, Bruno's eyes slowly opened, dulled by pain but still holding a flicker of awareness. No one said a word. No questions were asked. Only the baby's gaze, Bruno's faint sniff, and the trembling hands of the couple standing there were enough for Evelyn to understand. A family had found one another, not through blood, but through a journey that had crossed the edge of instinct, the depths of loneliness and the very heart of suffering. When Bruno's eyes met the gentle hand resting on his forehead, and the baby, from across the hallway, let out a faint smile through oxygen-tinted breaths, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't loud or grand, but it felt like a quiet harmony rising from hearts worn thin by waiting. Evelyn stood silently behind them, overwhelmed by the moment when two souls who had once wandered through wilderness, through fire, through the edge of death, now found light not in the raw instinct to survive, but in a bond born from something deeper, the very beginning of family. After an expedited legal review of the baby's medical files, witness statements, and the viral footage, the authorities confirmed that the child had no identification, no known family, and was likely abandoned as part of an ongoing criminal investigation, one tied to the trafficking ring Evelyn had helped expose through her testimony and the evidence found at the cabin. With that, the door to legal adoption opened, and Lucas and Hannah were the first to step forward, offering not just paperwork, but the kind of love and intention they'd been holding in their hearts for over a decade. But they had one request, one that left even the toughest staff at the Child Welfare Office emotional. "We don't want to adopt just the baby," Hannah said, her hand gripping Lucas's. "We want to adopt Bruno too, because this child can't grow up without him, and honestly, we don't want to live without a hero like him in our family." No one objected. In a private adoption ceremony held quietly at the hospital, attended by rescue workers, veterinary staff, a few journalists, and Evelyn, who had been there since the beginning, Bruno was officially listed in the adoption documents as the child's legal guardian. It was unprecedented, but everyone present agreed. It felt exactly right. When the paperwork was signed, Lucas walked to the crib and leaned over the baby, now without the oxygen tubes, cheeks warmer, eyes wide and alert, taking in the world as if for the first time. He smiled and whispered, "You have a name now. From today forward, you'll be called Hope, because that's what you are, the hope your mother and I waited a lifetime for." Evelyn turned away, tears silently sliding down her cheeks. Bruno, still recovering beside the hospital bed, wrapped in bandages and not yet fully healed, slowly lifted his head. When Lucas brought baby Hope close, Bruno reached forward, gently touching his nose to the child's tiny palm, then inhaled deeply, as if imprinting that scent into his very soul, the scent of life he had guarded with blood, breath, and everything he had left to give. The hospital doors opened. The family stepped out into the soft morning light. From a respectful distance, cameras clicked. No chaos, no frenzy, just one pure moment. A scarred dog walking beside a young couple cradling their daughter named Hope, as if the three of them had walked straight out of a real-life fairy tale. A story where the hero never needed words, only a heart. And from that moment on, Hope had a home. Bruno had a family. And the world had a living symbol of what it means to believe. That love, even when born from the wildest places, can still lead broken souls back to each other. When the doors of the hospital closed behind Bruno and Hope, a new chapter began. One where there were no sirens, no smoke, no knives hidden in coat pockets, no blinding surgical lights in the middle of the night. There was only life. Quiet, steady life. The kind made of tiny footsteps, soft giggles, and sunlight pouring gently through the windows of a small wooden home in the warm countryside. Lucas and Hannah had prepared for this for years, a nursery painted a soft cream, a wooden crib nestled beside the window, and a tiny mattress placed just below it, meant not for a pet, but for Bruno. The guardian, the older brother, the wingless angel watching over Hope. From the first day home, Hope, just over a year old, clung to Bruno as if she already knew the thread between them had been woven on that first night in the forest. She couldn't speak yet, but whenever she cried, Bruno would come close, lower his muzzle to her cheek, and the sobbing would quiet, replaced by soft baby murmurs that sounded like whispered secrets shared only between the two of them. Bruno, still healing, still wrapped in light bandages, never left her side. He didn't run, didn't play. He simply followed her to the yard each time she was carried outside, or lay with his head beside her crib at night, ears twitching at the slightest movement, ready to wake the world if she needed him. On cold winter nights, Lucas often got up just to check if Hope's blanket had slipped. But every time he opened her door, Bruno was already there, curled around her crib like a living shield, his breath rising and falling in rhythm with hers. And more than once, Hannah stood at the doorway, overcome by quiet tears, not of sorrow, but of a fragile, almost sacred happiness. Her daughter slept peacefully, one tiny hand resting on the scarred, warm back of the dog who had once walked through fire to find her. By the end of the first month, Hope had learned to crawl. Bruno slowed his steps so she could follow. He'd lie down beside her, stretch out a paw for her to grab, helping her pull herself up, balance, and wobble through her first attempts to walk. The day she finally took her first real steps wasn't when Lucas was holding her, or when Hannah reached out her arms. It was when Hope leaned out of the crib, placed her hand on Bruno's back, stepped shakily onto the floor, and walked across the living room toward him. She plopped down with a laugh, and Bruno turned his head, gave a soft snort, tail wagging just once, as if to say, "Nice job, little one." Bruno's wounds slowly closed. The skin grew back, thinner, more sensitive, but softer, a symbol of something reborn, and not just his body. The pain buried deep inside him, the nights of chains, the forced fights, the howling from dark cages, faded more and more with every stroke of a kind hand, every time his name was spoken gently, every time he was held and reminded that he was worthy of love from the very beginning. He no longer flinched when someone approached. He no longer growled at strangers. And for the first time in years, he slept. A real sleep. Not a restless one filled with dread, but one with dreams of sunshine, open fields, and the sound of Hope laughing as she called his name. Evelyn, whose presence had been a thread of fate tying them all together, still visited often. She no longer brought a camera or a notepad, just a basket of pastries, a few picture books, and a willingness to sit for hours on the porch, listening to Hope babble, Bruno's paws padding across the floor, and the quiet knowledge that the world, even after all it had been through, still held things worth believing in. One afternoon, as they sat watching the soft light play across the wooden deck, Evelyn turned to Lucas and said, "I used to think Bruno was the one who saved Hope, but now I believe Hope saved Bruno too. Not with strength, but with presence. With every unconscious hug, every wordless smile, she showed him what family means." 1 year had passed since Bruno collapsed inside a smoke-filled cabin, shielding Hope, the abandoned baby he'd found in the wild, with his own wounded body. And in that year, everything changed. There were no more growls, no more glints of knives, no more shadows of cages. Bruno now lived among laughter, morning sunlight, and the smell of fresh pastries from the kitchen of a home where love never needed proof. A place where scars weren't hidden, but cherished as signs of a heart that once fought with everything it had. But Bruno's story didn't belong only to the little family who had taken him in. His legacy, a dog with pure loyalty and courage that defied instinct, had become something far greater than a passing headline. It had become a symbol. From the original video Evelyn filmed and shared, millions of views poured in. But it didn't stop there. Hundreds of international news outlets picked up the story. Major broadcasters, BBC, CNN, even European and Asian networks, aired special features titled Bruno and Hope, Love in the Wild. People who once doubted animals, who once scoffed at the idea of loyalty beyond words, began to ask deeper questions about compassion. Letters and messages flooded the small town where Bruno lived from strangers who shared how his story had changed them, helped them heal, inspired them to begin again, all because of a dog. A non-profit project soon emerged, the Hope and Bruno Foundation, dedicated to rescuing abandoned dogs, rehabilitating them in safe environments, and pairing them with orphaned children and lonely elderly. Each rescued dog wore a collar with a small tag that read, "Love needs no language, only trust." Every year, thousands of volunteers joined, their efforts rooted in the inspiration Bruno had ignited. But perhaps the most moving moment came on the first anniversary of the rescue, when the city council unveiled a small bronze statue outside the hospital where Hope had been saved and where Bruno had fought to stay alive for 2 days. There was no grand opening, no red carpet, no celebrity appearances, just a quiet circle of people, each holding a white flower or a piece of pale blue knit cloth, tokens of what Bruno had taught them. that unconditional love was real. The statue was small, only knee-height, but perfectly shaped. Bruno lying down, eyes lifted toward the horizon where sunlight poured through pine trees. Behind him, a bundled blanket, a symbol of hope. At the base, carved into the stone, were these simple, powerful words. Bruno, the dog who taught humanity what unconditional love means. He didn't bark. He didn't run. He stayed. That day, Lucas and Hannah brought Hope, now walking and calling out, "Daddy, Mommy, and Bruo," to the statue. Hope ran ahead, placed her tiny hand on the statue's muzzle as if recognizing her old friend. And Bruno, now graying around the eyes, stepped forward, lay down beside the statue, gave a quiet sniff, and stayed silent. But in that silence was agreement. Everyone watching cried, not from sadness, but because they knew they were witnessing something no words could fully hold. A sacred moment, when a creature once cast out by the world became a beacon for thousands of hearts. Not long after, a well-known documentary filmmaker contacted Evelyn, asking to adapt the story into a short film. She agreed, but on one condition. Don't change the ending. Don't make Bruno speak. He's already said everything through what he did. The film, titled The Guardian of Hope, premiered that year at international festivals and won multiple awards for its deeply human message. Years later, people still told their children and grandchildren about a dog named Bruno, who stepped out of darkness, overcame instinct, and faced evil, fire, and storm, all to protect one small life in arms that could not speak. And when Hope grew older, she would often bring her friends to the statue. She'd sit on the grass, gently pat Bruno's real head, by then slow-moving, nearly blind, but still beating with love, and whisper, "He saved me, and he's the only one who's never left me. Bruno isn't a dog. Bruno is home." Bruno began his life shackled and scarred, but he walked out of the darkness not with teeth or claws, but with a heart. From a forgotten fighter, he became a silent hero, a living symbol of loyalty, protection, and unconditional love, something even humans still need to learn from animals. Hope, the abandoned child in the forest, was not only saved but became the light, the reason Bruno kept walking, the reward at the end of a path made of fire, tears, and ultimately love. What do you think of this extraordinary journey? If it were you, what name would you have given Hope? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We read and treasure every word you share. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share it to spread the kindness, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss more stories of friendship, family, and real-life miracles. Thank you for watching, thank you for believing, and we'll see you again with Bruno and Hope